The late afternoon sun cast long amber streaks across the quiet town of Willow Creek, a settlement where traditions ran deeper than the river cutting through its borders. Rancher Ethan Hayes guided his horse toward the town council hall, his jaw set in silent irritation. He had received a summons, formal, urgent, and signed by the town elders, and though he had half a mind to ignore it, responsibility tugged at him like reins on a stubborn stallion. At 33, Ethan was known as a man who worked hard and spoke little. He had inherited the Hayes Ranch after his father's passing, and though he managed the land with grit and skill, the past 2 years had been hard. A drought had thinned his herd, debts had piled up, and neighboring ranchers had begun eyeing his property like vultures circling weakened prey. Still, if anyone suggested he needed help, or worse, needed a wife, he would shut them down without hesitation. Inside the hall, townsfolk filled the seats, weathered ranchers, strict matrons, and members of the council with expressions that blended concern and calculation. Ethan felt the tension before a word was spoken. "Ethan," began Councilman Rourke, a broad-shouldered man with graying whiskers, "you know the land ordinance passed last spring. Unmarried ranch owners without a lawful heir risk forfeiture of unused acreage. The town can't afford instability." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "My land is my business. Regulations or not, I'm not handing it over." A murmur rippled through the room. Then Mrs. Darlene Hawthorne, a sharp-tongued widow and unofficial voice of the town's women, clasped her hands. "No one is asking you to give it up. We're offering a solution to your debts, your land, and your future." Ethan crossed his arms. "What kind of solution?" The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Then Rourke spoke again. "Marriage. To Clara Bennett." The name hit him harder than a kick to the ribs. Clara Bennett lived on the edge of town with her elderly father. She was 30, quiet, and painfully reserved. Town gossip had branded her an old maid, though no one could fault her character. She tended her family's small homestead, handled accounts for the church, and nursed her father through illness without complaint. But labels in Willow Creek stuck like burrs, and hers had become a shield and a prison. "I'm not marrying out of convenience," Ethan growled. "This isn't just about convenience," said Mrs. Hawthorne briskly. "Your ranch needs a legal partnership to retain its water rights. Clara's homestead is under threat from debt collectors. This union addresses both problems." Ethan straightened. "So you're pairing off the desperate?" "We're securing the future of this town," Rourke replied firmly. "You're proud, Ethan, and you've worked hard. But pride doesn't pay the farrier or keep your land from being divided." Before Ethan could snap back, the back door opened softly. Clara stepped inside. She wore a faded blue dress, her brown hair pulled into a simple knot. Her eyes, steady, not timid, scanned the room, then settled on Ethan. She hadn't been dragged into the council's plan, she had been asked, and she had come willingly. That unsettled Ethan more than he cared to admit. Councilwoman Mercy Tate rose. "Clara knows why she's here. Her family owes on their land. Without support, the Bennetts will lose everything by harvest's end." Clara clasped her hands gently at her waist. "My father is not well. I can't allow his life's work to vanish. When they approached me, I didn't agree immediately, but I listened." Ethan met her gaze. "And you're fine with being offered like a solution?" A breath of silence passed before Clara responded. "I don't see myself as an object. I see a circumstance. One that may harm us both if ignored." There was no accusation in her tone, only quiet resolve. Ethan, for all his stubbornness, recognized strength when he saw it. The council pressed on. The proposal was simple: a legal marriage between Ethan Hayes and Clara Bennett would merge lands, protect water and grazing rights, and quell pressure from creditors. In return, Clara would gain stability and security for her father. No romantic pretense, no illusions, just duty disguised as opportunity. Ethan wanted to refuse. Every instinct in him recoiled from the idea of being cornered. But as he looked around the room, at the faces expecting, demanding, hoping, he understood the truth. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. And somehow, the quiet woman standing with unbowed dignity made the choice even harder to dismiss. The ultimatum had been spoken. The consequences loomed. And though no one realized it yet, this forced union would come to reshape both their lives in ways duty could never dictate. The wedding took place a week later, Not in a church adorned with flowers or music, but in the parlor of the town clerk's office. There were no vows of love, no tender glances, no audience beyond 3 witnesses, Councilman Rourke, Mrs. Hawthorne, and Clara's frail father, who sat wrapped in a woolen coat despite the warmth of the room. Ethan wore a clean shirt and his laced-worn boots out of respect, and Clara arrived in a pale cream dress that had been carefully mended at the sleeves. Neither smiled. The ceremony was brief. When the clerk announced them husband and wife, Ethan gave a stiff nod, while Clara whispered a quiet thank you to the witnesses before helping her father back outside. No one tossed rice. No hands clapped. The town had gotten what it wanted, a practical marriage, not a celebration. Ethan rode ahead to prepare the ranch house while Clara traveled by wagon with her father and a single wooden trunk of belongings. When they arrived, Ethan stood on the front steps with the awkwardness of a man offering hospitality to a stranger instead of his wife. "I fixed up the spare room for your pa," he said gruffly, not quite meeting her gaze. "Figured you'd want him close." Clara nodded. "Thank you. He'll rest easier near me." Ethan helped carry her father inside, careful and silent. They settled the old man in the downstairs room beside the kitchen, where he could avoid climbing stairs. Clara unpacked her father's quilts and placed a small framed photograph of Clara's mother on the bedside table. Ethan watched from the doorway, arms crossed. He respected her composure, though he didn't dare admit it. When Clara turned around, he stepped back. "Your room's upstairs. Mine's across the hall," he said quickly. "We don't need to share anything that ain't necessary." Clara met his words with calm acceptance. "I didn't expect we would." That first evening, they ate supper in near total silence. Clara cooked because she didn't want to be idle, potatoes, biscuits, and the leftover roast Ethan had made the night before. She served plates without asking preference, and he accepted without comment. At the table, the distance between them felt wider than the ranch fields outside. Ethan focused on his food. Clara focused on not looking like an intruder. The only sounds were the clink of cutlery and the distant creaking of the windmill. After dinner, Ethan disappeared to the barn to check on the horses. Clara washed dishes by hand, the cool water pricking her skin. She listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, the ticking clock, the faint lowing of cattle in the distance, the lazy flicker of the oil lamp. Her father's soft coughing from the next room reminded her why she was here. Upstairs, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees. He wasn't a cruel man, but the arrangement chafed like a too-tight collar. Having another person, another presence, in his home unsettled him more than he'd expected. Especially someone he owed something to. In her room across the hall, Clara laid out her nightdress and folded the dress she'd worn. Everything she owned fit into the wooden trunk and a single basket. She stared out the window into the darkened yard, where the corral fences stood like silhouettes and the barn lantern cast a dull glow. She wasn't afraid, just uncertain of how long politeness could hold 2 strangers in place. By the end of the first week, a rhythm had formed, not born of comfort but necessity. Clara helped with the cooking and cleaning, tended to her father, and occasionally assisted in the garden or chicken coop. Ethan spent long hours outside working the cattle and fencing the north pasture. They spoke only when required. The town whispered endlessly but saw little. To outsiders, this quiet coexistence seemed proof that the marriage was merely a contract. And inside the Hayes Ranch house, neither Ethan nor Clara dared argue that assumption. They shared a roof, not a life. A name, not a bond. For now, cold civility was the only peace they both understood. The first crack in their silent arrangement came with the wind. By late October, the plains around Willow Creek turned bitter and sharp, the kind of cold that slipped through cracks in the wood and rattled windows at night. One morning, Clara stepped out onto the porch to gather firewood and saw the sky bruised with storm clouds. The wind carried the warning of snow. She found Ethan saddling his horse near the barn. "There's trouble in the east pasture," he said without turning. "Fence posts down. If the herd wanders before the storm hits, we'll lose half of 'em." Clara hesitated, then spoke. "I can help." Ethan paused, surprised. "It's half a day's ride and rough work. Ain't necessary. My father is resting. Mrs. Carter will visit him later. You need an extra set of hands." Reluctance flickered across his face, but he didn't argue. Minutes later, She rode beside him on a bay mare named Hazel, wrapped in Ethan's spare coat. The cold bit at their cheeks, but neither complained. By the time they reached the broken fence line, the wind had grown fierce. Several posts had snapped, likely from a recent storm. A portion of the herd grazed dangerously close to the ridge. Ethan tied his horse to a low branch and retrieved tools from his saddlebag. Clara followed and knelt beside him without waiting for instruction. Together, they lifted and reset posts, using wire and spare wood to brace the fence. He finally spoke. "Didn't figure you knew anything about post work." "My grandfather kept cattle," she said, looping wire with steady hands. "I watched more than people thought." A stray heifer tried to wander off, and Clara whistled sharply, guiding it back with the ease of someone who understood herd behavior. Ethan stared a moment, then returned to his task without comment. But his perspective shifted. By midday, the clouds had darkened into a leaden ceiling. Snow began to fall in slow, heavy flakes, clinging to coats and lashes. They worked in silence, save for the creak of wood and the lowing of cattle. When the last post was secured, Ethan mounted up and motioned for her to follow. "Storm'll vary the low trails. Ride close." As they herded the cattle back toward the main pasture, a calf slipped into a shallow ditch. Clara dismounted before Ethan could react. She knelt in the snow and coaxed the calf free, guiding it gently toward its mother. The wind whipped her hair loose, and cold reddened her cheeks, but her eyes held calm purpose. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the storm had swallowed the sky in white silence. Clara's hands were numb, and Ethan noticed the way she flexed her fingers as she fed the fire. "You should warm up," he said awkwardly. "I'll see to the horses." She paused by the hearth. "There's soup left from yesterday. I'll heat it." He nodded, expecting nothing more. But when he came back inside, the smell of broth and herbs filled the kitchen. Clara handed him a steaming bowl and sat at the table with her own. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of firewood and the muffled howl of the storm beyond the walls. Ethan finally glanced at her. "You held your own out there." She looked up. "I didn't marry to sit uselessly by the stove." He grunted, more respect than irritation in the sound. "Didn't expect you to." Their eyes met briefly, not warm, not soft, but changed. Later that night, while checking the barn lanterns, Ethan caught himself thinking of the way she steadied the fence post and guided the calf. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't timid. She moved with a quiet strength that unsettled his assumptions. Inside the house, Clara sat by her father's bed and replayed the day in silence. She had not expected gratitude, nor did she seek it, but something in Ethan's gaze had shifted. Not kindness, but recognition. The walls between them remained, but hairline cracks had begun to show, letting in the faintest trace of something neither had planned for. Winter settled over the valley like a heavy quilt, muting sound and slowing life to a crawl. Snow clung to the rooftops and fences, and nights stretched long and silent. Inside the ranch house, routines that once felt strained now carried a quiet rhythm neither Ethan nor Clara had expected. Clara spent mornings splitting kindling, tending the stove, and checking on her father, whose health had begun to stabilize with regular meals and warmth. She also helped in the barn when needed, mucking stalls, brushing the horses, and scattering feed with practiced efficiency. Ethan stopped trying to redirect her to softer tasks once he realized she did not break under work. One afternoon, after repairing a broken latch in the chicken coop, Ethan found Clara in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to her elbows as she kneaded dough. She didn't notice him at first. "You're using too much flour," he said gruffly, leaning on the doorway. She glanced up, unoffended. "And yet your hands are cleaner than mine. If you want better bread, make it yourself." He blinked, unsure if she was teasing or challenging him. Then, unexpectedly, his mouth twitched. "Fair enough." Over the following days, he lingered a little longer at the table during meals. She asked fewer polite questions and spoke more plainly. Their words stayed practical, but some of the stiffness had eased. Still, the town watched from a distance, whispering behind windows and shop counters. "They don't ride to town together." She still signs her name Bennett when she shops. "He sleeps in the loft some nights." But what the town didn't see were the subtle shifts beneath the surface. The first real turning point came in February. A large ranch owner named Silas Drew, long known for sizing up land like a man eyeing cuts of meat, rode onto Bennett land uninvited. Clara had walked there alone to settle some of her father's remaining records when Drew arrived with 2 men and a folded deed in his coat. Ethan, who had been mending tack in the barn, saw the riders and followed on horseback. By the time he dismounted near the Bennett property, voices were raised. "I told you, this land is not for sale," Clara said, standing in the cold with no coat, her jaw set. "Our debts are being handled." Drew leaned closer, his tone slick with false patience. "Your father's papers say otherwise, and a widow's union doesn't hold standing without signature. You're in no place to refuse an offer." Before Clara could answer, Ethan stepped between them. "She's not refusing," he said, his voice low but clear. "I am. That land's legally tied to my ranch now. Any papers go through me." Drew's expression curdled. "This arrangement won't hold forever." "It'll hold long enough," Ethan replied, his gaze unshaken. "Now get off our land." Drew hesitated, glancing at Clara, then turned his horse. Snow crunched under hooves as he and his men rode off. Clara exhaled slowly. Ethan removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders without a word. She looked up at him, not with surprise, but something softer. "Thank you," she said. "Wasn't about thanks," he muttered. "Was about what's rightfully yours." They stood in the silence of winter, breath fogging in the air. When they returned home, Clara prepared coffee while Ethan stoked the fire. Her father had dozed off, unaware of the confrontation. Clara set a mug in front of Ethan and sat across from him. "You didn't have to come." He met her eyes. "Yes, I did." There was no argument in her after that. That evening, she mended the cuff of his coat by lamplight. He noticed but didn't comment. When he brought her a fresh stack of firewood without being asked, she didn't thank him with words, but the look she gave him said enough. Affection had not announced itself with fanfare. It crept in quietly, through small defenses surrendered, and silent acknowledgments of loyalty neither had expected to give. What began as necessity was becoming something neither could dismiss as obligation. Spring brought mud before it brought warmth. Snowmelt turned the pastures soft and the riverbanks slick, but it also loosened winter's grip on the land, and on the people living upon it. By March, Clara's father had regained enough strength to sit on the porch in the mornings, wrapped in a quilt and watching the cattle graze. Clara spent less time hovering over him and more time working alongside Ethan. The house, once silent, now held the sounds of life, chickens clucking near the kitchen door, boots on floorboards, kettle steam whistling at dusk. They still lived carefully, but the distance between them had shortened to something that no longer felt like a divide. The final turning point came on a Sunday afternoon. Clouds rolled in from the west, heavy with the threat of rain. Ethan was repairing a corral fence near the southern slope when he spotted smoke in the distance, thin, then thick, curling above the line of trees that bordered the Bennett property. His stomach tightened. He dropped his tools, saddled his horse in minutes, and rode harder than he had in months. By the time he reached the backfield of the Bennett homestead, a small fire had already caught dry brush along the fence. Clara was there, alone, hauling buckets from the trough and beating back flames with a soaked wool blanket. "Clara!" Ethan jumped down, voice hoarse. "Where's your father?" "In the carriage shed. The fire hasn't reached it." She swung the blanket again, coughing through the smoke. "The wind picked up. I couldn't leave it." Ethan didn't waste another word. He grabbed another blanket from the saddle and began dousing the blaze with ruthless, focused determination. The fire spread along the fence line, threatening to climb up the dry posts and into the trees beyond. Together, they worked in brutal, choking heat, passing buckets, beating sparks, smothering ignition before it could leap higher. When the wind shifted, a crackling branch snapped off a nearby pine and crashed into the fence. Embers scattered like angry wasps. Clara stumbled on uneven ground, and the fire flared near her skirts. Before she could regain balance, Ethan grabbed her waist and pulled her back, his coat thrown over the burning patch to suffocate the sparks. For a frozen heartbeat, His arm stayed around her as the air roared with smoke and adrenaline. They didn't speak. They kept fighting until the last ember died. Rain followed the smoke, pattering softly over blackened brush and damp earth. Clara sat on a fallen log catching her breath, hair clinging to her cheeks. Ethan poured water into his palm and offered it wordlessly. She took it, fingers brushing his. "You could have stayed at the ranch," she said finally, voice quiet. He shook his head. "Wasn't about the ranch." She looked at him, truly looked, and something in her expression unfastened. "You came for me." He didn't pretend otherwise. "I'll come every time." There was no hesitation in his tone, no guardedness. Just truth, clean and bare. Her eyes glistened, not from smoke this time. "Ethan. This was never meant to be more than survival." He stepped closer. "Maybe it started that way. Maybe it ain't that now." The silence between them wasn't cold anymore. That evening, back at the ranch, after Clara checked on her father and Ethan washed soot from his hands, they met in the kitchen. The lamplight flickered gently over the table. Ethan rested his palms on the back of a chair. "I don't want this to be just an arrangement anymore." Clara's breath caught. She set down the cup she was holding. "Then what do you want it to be?" He hesitated only a moment. "Yours. And mine. Not forced. Chosen." Her answer came not in a rush of words but in the quiet steps that brought her across the room. She reached up, touched his soot-streaked cheek, and whispered, "Then choose me again. And I'll choose you back." He did. Not with ceremony or grand gesture, but with an embrace that spoke the promise neither of them needed to rehearse. In the eyes of the town, their marriage had always been a practical solution. But in the quiet truth of the ranch house, in the spaces between duty and disaster and hard-won trust, something deeper had taken root. What was forced had become chosen. And what began as a contract had grown into a home of the heart.